Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Bernadette Atuahene's newest book opens with the story of a woman who lived in the same Detroit home for 50 years. But her once vibrant neighborhood is now mostly vacant lots. The reason? Property taxes. Property taxes that were illegally inflated, and it's one of several racist housing policies that shapes who does or doesn't have generational wealth in the U.S. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about government policies that impact the homes and neighborhoods where people live. Bernadette Atuahene is professor of law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Her new book is Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. Bernadette, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor and pleasure.
I want to talk about your work in this amazing new book, which focuses on Detroit, but also using Detroit as a way of understanding the legacies of these racist housing policies and their impact on generations of Black families. Before we talk about this book, I am curious about how you decided to pursue this topic, or what is it about this area of understanding that speaks to you?
So all my work deals with land stolen from Black people, and I do ethnography, which, as you know, means I live and immerse myself in the place I study. So my first ethnography was actually in South Africa, where I did an ethnography of the country's land restitution program. In my first book, We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program. And in that book, I interviewed over 150 people whose land was stolen during apartheid and colonialism, and they got some form of compensation, either land or money, through the post-apartheid government through this land restitution program. And the book tries to understand the psychological, political, social impact of getting something back. So that project was wildly successful. At the book launch in Johannesburg, the Deputy Land Claims Commissioner himself attended and announced that they intended to adopt 90% of the book's recommendations. So, but although it was wildly successful, it was really uncomfortable for me in many ways because it looked at Black people as being stolen from. So for my next ethnographic project, I wanted to look at Black people doing the stealing. And so I decided to study squatting, where, again, definition of squatting is people who are occupying a property without the permission of the record owner. And the last big squatting phenomenon in the U.S. was really on the Lower East Side of New York. But what's currently happening in Detroit far outpaces what happened on the Lower East Side of New York. So I won a big National Science Foundation grant to study squatting in Detroit. And in the law, there are two kinds of squatters: holdovers and takeovers. A takeover is what, regular people think of as a squatter, someone who comes onto a property with no legal relationship to that property. But I teach first year property law at USC, and I teach my students about holdovers. And those are people who had some legal relationship and fell out of it. So I had to really interview equal numbers of both. And when I was interviewing the holdovers, one after the other kept telling me that they were owners and they got property tax foreclosed, stayed in the home waiting for the new owner to show up. And I said, what? At that point, I knew a lot about mortgage foreclosure, but I knew very little about property tax foreclosure. So I had to do my homework, and I soon discovered that since 2009, 1 in 3 homes has completed the property tax foreclosure process in Detroit. 1 in 3. We haven't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression. So since I do ethnography, I couldn't ignore it because all my neighbors were losing their homes. So I switched my project from squatting to doing an ethnography of property tax foreclosure. And I've lived full time in Detroit since 2017, trying to understand the crisis from those I live beside.
That lens of understanding the crisis from those you live beside, that is a way of humanizing the experiences, of putting a face, a legacy, a history on this challenge, and of raising something that is happening all around you, but people aren't perhaps naming it in that way because it's just the life that they are living. One of the things that I so appreciate about this book is that you make reference to that long arc of history of how do we get to a place where we are seeing an unprecedented rate and concentration of foreclosures. And the ways that you provide that context in your first book looking at South Africa, you bring that to Detroit, which is this historic, storied city in the United States. And I would argue also a city that is very misunderstood in terms of that. You look at the families of two men who moved to Detroit in the early 1900s to work for Ford. Share with our listeners a little bit about those families.
Absolutely. So in my law review work, I've written lots of law review articles. I really tell people what's going on. But what I do in Plundered, How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America, is I don't tell people, I show them. And just as you said, I use these two grandfathers. One is Grandpa Bucci. He comes from Italy. And the other is Grandpa Brown. He's an African-American who comes from North Carolina. What's interesting about these two men is they both were sharecroppers in their place of origin. Grandpa Bucci was a sharecropper in Italy under a system called mezzadria. He, after the Great War, leaves to France. Then he joins his sister in Canada, hears that Henry Ford is paying people the astonishing wage of $5 a day, and he jumps over to work at Ford's River Rouge factory about 1903. At the same time, Grandpa Brown is in North Carolina, a sharecropper. Through the Great Migration, he leaves North Carolina to come to Detroit because he also hears about the astonishing wages of $5 a day, and he begins like 1905. So you have these two men, very similar backgrounds. They both come from poverty. They both start at the River Rouge factory at about the same time. And the River Rouge factory was one of the most dirtiest and dangerous of Ford's factories. So what the book is able to show you is that although Grandpa Bucci never had an easy life, right? Grandpa Bucci had 4 fingers because one got cut off in a work accident. Grandpa Bucci was subjected to anti-Italian sentiments. Grandpa Bucci did not have an easy life at all, but he never at any point had to deal with racially restrictive covenants, which is covenants tucked in deeds which disallowed Black people from occupying certain areas, particularly the suburbs where the houses were larger, cheaper, with better amenities. Although Grandpa Bucci had it hard, at no point did him or his Italian community deal with redlining, where the federal government drew a red line around the area just because because we're Black, saying that these areas are a credit risk and so don't lend there. And so, of course, the inevitable result of no lending home repair loans is blight. And so Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, but he never had his community redlined. Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, but he never had to deal with blockbusting, which is the fact that comes from redlining, because Black people's presence could literally reduce the value of homes because of redlining, that when Black people would move into any area, these real estate intermediaries would say, the Black people are coming, white people, you got to get out or you're going to lose everything. And it didn't matter how white people felt about Black people. They left because they knew, in fact, the presence of Blacks could reduce the market value. These intermediaries then sold the homes to Blacks at increased prices. And so over the space of 1 to 5 years, it could be a block that was totally white is now totally Black. That's called blockbusting. Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, but at no point was his community subjected to urban renewal, which is when the federal government and local governments, again, based on the blight created by their own redlining, they tried to erase that blight. But what they erased is not only the blight, but the unblighted homes, the Black businesses, the Black cultural institutions. They erased entire communities. And because of segregation, there were only a few communities where Blacks could relocate to. But now these new spaces where people are relocating to are communities of strangers. Once you had communities of tightly knit communities with thick social capital, now you have vulnerable communities. So all of these, although Grandpa Bucci had a hard life, he didn't deal with any of these racist policies I've just laid out. He didn't deal with racial covenants. He didn't have to deal with redlining. He didn't have to do with blockbusting. He didn't have to deal with urban renewal. And what I do in the book is I show you their progeny. So Grandpa Bucci's grandson now lives in the home he bought in the suburbs, and the home is worth over $250,000. And I asked Robert Ficano, his grandson, why do you still live in your grandfather's home? He was like, duh, because the note's paid off. Why wouldn't I live here? Myrisha, who's Grandpa Brown's granddaughter, who inherited his home, didn't inherit a valuable asset. Instead, she inherits a money pit worth less than $10,000. And so, again, by showing you these two grandfathers' lives, and again, she inherits a money pit because of redlining, modern day and historic redlining. And so when homes have not been provided the capital to do the regular upkeep, of course, they're going to be dilapidated and blighted. And so, again, through not telling you, but showing you through these two grandfathers' lives, I'm able to show people what the effect of these racist policies are on not only historical circumstances, but intergenerational wealth today.
You know, the first urban politics course I took in class, my professor said, we're going to learn about a concept called urban renewal, but I need you to know that it was really Negro removal. And I remember we were all stunned in this class. Like, what did he just say? And what did he mean about that? But the more that he talked about that concept, which is what you just said, in an area, I think a lot of people think about it today as gentrification. But this was something different. It was targeted and intentional in a very different way of an area that says we will decide we want to develop this and we will purposely make it difficult, not just for people to stay, but to transfer that asset and be able to accumulate generational wealth. I'm curious, Bernadette, what do you make of when people are looking at the different fates of different neighborhoods? They always assume a pathology. People just don't care about where they live. People just don't have pride in their home or their neighborhoods. That's why they don't do renovations. That's why they don't have upkeep. What you're talking about is something much more structural, something that is passed on across generations, that even when people have pride in their place, there are these other factors that make it more difficult to reap the financial benefits of that. Talk to us about how your work pushes back against that pathology that many people believe in.
Yeah, that pathology, I call those narratives of personal irresponsibility. And so when you look at a Black community and the buildings are dilapidated, et cetera, people look at that community and think, well, the problem must be the people living in that community because that's what's visible. Is the people living in that community. Then the narratives of personal irresponsibility start. The problem is Black people commit too much crime. They have babies out of wedlock, right? So it goes on and on. But what is hidden are these racist policies that I've been talking to you about. This community looks like it looks because the federal government drew a red line around it and prevented resources, home repair loans, mortgages from coming into this community. That's why this community is dilapidated. But these racist policies are invisible. But what's visible are the Black people living in the communities. And so they receive all of the blame. And I also think it's our job as people who love justice to really at every moment transition conversations from these narratives of personal irresponsibility to highlighting the racist policies at work. It's our job as people who love justice from making the invisible visible, and making these really highlighting the role of the racist policies in terms of the current situation.
You have interviewed an impressive number of people for this work. And I imagine that sometimes people are reluctant to engage because they wonder, will you be able to honor this history? Will you be able to honor what it meant for my grandfather to move from North Carolina to Detroit with a sharecropper's background, a sharecropper's level of education, and want something better for his children and his grandchildren? And even when the something better didn't align perhaps with what others thought it should be, there's a dignity in that kind of commitment. Share with us, given those interviews that you did, share with us some of the stories that you learned about the impact on family in the moment when these things were happening, but also the legacies.
What's so interesting? So one of the main characters of the book is Myrisha, the granddaughter of Grandpa Brown. And, we had our first interview in this stuffy office at UCHC. And I had scheduled 90 minutes from the interview. But when the interview ended, she was just getting going. So over the course of several years, we did several more interviews. And I was able to really get her full story. And I accidentally learned about her grandfather. And then I realized my other subject's grandfather had both worked at the same factory around the same time. So that whole setup of the book was accidental and happened through these interviews. But what's so interesting is then Myrisha, when she reads the book, she's even learning about her own experience because she doesn't see the impact of these racist policies on her story. So it's not just, certain people don't see it. It's the people themselves impacted by these racist policies that don't often even see those policies or understand how they work in their own stories. So, that was part of what happens as well when she reads it back. And part of her reading it back, too, was just, she told me, she was like, always said, while talking to you is like therapy. I just love kind of getting it out. And, as she's telling me all of this, she then, because one of my methodologies in my research is I do a read back. So you tell me, we do all the interviews, I get the story together, then I read it back, and it provides my subjects a chance to say, did I get it right, number one? And I allow them say, if you want to change anything or don't want me to say something, I give them that authority so that we're really co-constructing the story. But more importantly, with the read back, it triggers memories there, and I get more information from the read back. But as I did the read back with Myrisha, she just was in tears. And I was like, are you okay? She said, yeah. I was just like hearing it all in the space of, 30 minutes. I've been through a lot. I was like, yes, my dear, you have been through a lot.
Coming up, more with plundered author Bernadette Atuahene. She'll talk about who makes money from property tax foreclosures in Detroit. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about how discriminatory policies impact the neighborhoods and houses people live in. We're joined now by law professor Bernadette Atuahene. Her new book is Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. One of the chapters in the book is called The Yellow Bag. I asked Bernadette to tell me about the significance of the yellow bag.
So basically, the yellow bag is what's hung on the door when you are going through property tax foreclosure. It's all of the mandatory legal notices. And Myrisha, I tell the story in my book of when she saw the yellow bag on her door, and she thought it was like one of those circulars with the ads. And then she looked inside and realized what was happening. She was being foreclosed on. And so many emotions overtook Myrisha when she saw that yellow bag. She was scared. She was depressed. She felt anxiety. But most of all, she felt shame because everyone now knew that she was on the verge of losing her grandparents' home. But when she looked up, she noticed, whoa, almost every house on the block has a yellow bag attached to it. So at that point, she knew something was going on, but she didn't know exactly what was going on. And again, through my research, not only I've gone through, I've done interviews, hundreds of interviews of homeowners, investors, government officials. I've gone through reams and reams of property tax assessment data. I even took a 9-month course and passed a state exam to become a certified Michigan property tax assessor. So through my really robust investigation, I found that between 2009 and 2015, in each of those 7 years, the city of Detroit overtaxed its homeowners by between 53 and 84%. And when I say overtaxed, the Michigan State Constitution says no property can be assessed at more than 50% of its market value. And it wasn't just my study. The Detroit News did an expose, and they found that the city of Detroit overtaxed homeowners by at least $600 million. So when you think of a racist policy, and again, a racist policy is something that a policy, a procedure, a practice that produces racial inequality. The way property taxes are calculated in Detroit is a racist policy. And also not only the way they're calculated in Detroit, but I did another study about Wayne County. And we found that the supermajority of the black cities are being subjected to these unconstitutional property tax assessments and foreclosures at a far greater rate than the majority white cities. Again, this is racial injustice. This is the way Wayne County calculates its property taxes is a racist policy because it produces this racial inequity. And so when we see what's going on with these racist policies, it's not just Detroit, it's not just Wayne County, but the national data says that blacks and Hispanics pay a 10 to 13% higher property tax rate than whites for the same bundle of goods, which on average equals $300 to $400 a year, more a year. So this racialized property tax administration is a racial justice issue that our nation has not yet begun to deal with. Racialized property tax administration is a silent driver of the racial wealth divide. Racial property tax administration is, again, and I need you to understand, this is another racist policy, just like racial covenants and blockbusting and redlining and predatory mortgage lending. Property tax is another racist policy that black and brown people actually are dealing with today. And the last thing I'll say is, this yellow bag is really the symbol in Detroit of this injustice of the property tax foreclosure crisis. But Myrisha, when she got this bag, she actually blamed herself. We talked about these narratives of personal irresponsibility. When she got the bag in the interview, she said, Prof, the problem is I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. And these narratives of personal irresponsibility were also being told and the people I interviewed from the government. One government official said, well, Professor, the problem is people just don't want to pay their taxes. Another said, well, people bought homes they couldn't afford. And the Detroit treasurer at the time told me that, Professor, the problem is people are buying purses instead of paying their taxes. And so it's not just these government officials with these narratives of personal responsibility, but they're being internalized as well by the people in the situation. And so when I'm doing my interviews, I cannot tell you, because I'm an empath. So if you start crying, I'm gonna start crying, and I'm gonna start ugly crying. Like I'm not the slight tears. I'm like, I'm with you. And so what I had to do a lot of times is hang up the phone because I didn't want to bias my data and call people back and say, hey, my brother, hey, my sister, I need you to know that there was some injustice hidden in these complex property tax calculations. I want you to know that these racist policies had you out here trying to slay a dragon with a butter knife. And, again, but people, even Myrisha, she blames herself because these racist policies, the fact that she's being overtaxed, she can't see it. They're invisible. And so she blames herself, as those in authority are also blaming her. And these racist policies get no blame.
The other piece of it that I think is so critical to connect the dots is what is creating destruction for the Myrishas of Detroit, what is creating this sense of shame and stigma and loss is creating wealth for other people who can then swoop in after the foreclosure. Talk to our listeners about what happens after the yellow bag, after foreclosure actually happens. What happens to that property? What's happened in Detroit?
And that's a big part of the book, is following the money. Right. So the question is, there's all this property tax foreclosure and delinquency in Detroit. Who's making the money? Well, when you follow the money, the biggest moneymaker is actually not the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit is actually losing money because when you foreclose on a home, the home next to it, the property value goes down, right? It creates blight. They no longer are collecting taxes from that home. So there's a net loss for the city of Detroit. So who then is making money? Well, when you follow the money, you find that it is Wayne County that is making the money. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of people know that Detroit went through the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history and was subjected to an emergency manager. But what many people don't know is the county was also headed toward emergency management and bankruptcy at the time. And they saved themselves from emergency management and bankruptcy on the backs of property tax delinquency and foreclosure in Detroit. What do I mean by that? There's an account called the Delinquent Tax Revolving Fund. And this account is where all the money from the houses sold from tax foreclosure auction go. It's the place where the statutorily mandated 18% interest penalty goes, because in the state of Michigan, when you're late on your taxes, they charge you an 18% interest penalty as if you have the money but just don't want to pay the money. But when you're actually poor and don't have the money, that 18% interest penalty is just making things worse. But all that 18% interest also goes into the Delinquent Tax Revolving Fund. And the story is that fund is what the county used to save itself from, again, bankruptcy and emergency management. So when you follow the money, the number one moneymaker was Wayne County. But I also show you the really diverse other people who are making money by buying these illegally foreclosed on homes from the auction. We have people from Argentina, coming to buy the homes. There's people from the suburbs buying the homes. And there's actually Black Detroit, because Detroit's an 80% Black city. There's Black Detroiters themselves buying these homes. There's these large land speculators buying these homes. And so the book really goes through the wide cast of characters who are making money from this tragedy.
There may be people listening to this conversation who think they know a little bit about Detroit, or at least familiar with Detroit. And the statistic that you just gave, right? This is a city that is majority Black people. This is a city who gave us Coleman Young as a mayor for 20 years of mayoral administration. And there will be people who say, how can this happen in a city that is majority Black in its residents, a city that has had not only Black mayors, but Black executives, thriving Black businesses, and presumably thriving Black infrastructure? Some people may say, well, how could we call it racist when the people who are, quote unquote, in these positions of power are there? What's your response to that question?
Yeah, that's why it's so important to use the language of a racist policy, because a racist policy, it doesn't talk about intention. And I think in America, the way we talk about race, we're obsessed with the racist, right? We are obsessed with intention. And what I'm saying, if I sit here and punch you, it's nonsense for us to talk about whether I meant to punch you or not. We need to get you stitched up, fix the problem. And so when we talk about racist policies, not to say whether it's intentional or not is separate, but the point is all we care about is that this policy or procedure is producing racial inequity. We don't care if it intended to do it, if it was some master plan to do it. All we care about is there a policy, procedure, practice, law that's producing racial inequity? We name it and then we disassemble it. And that's also why in my book, I actually use the title is Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. I don't use the language of structural injustice. I don't use the language of systemic injustice on purpose, because systemic injustice, what does that even mean, number one? And it's so daunting. What can you do about it? It mobilizes people. But when you shift from talking about structural racism to racist policies are something that's understandable to the common person. And racist policies, it forces the person making the claim to lay out all of the policies underlying this. So, for instance, in my case of the property tax foreclosure crisis in Detroit, the various policies are the facts that the lowest valued homes in Detroit are taxed at a higher rate than the higher valued home. It's a policy of the 18% interest penalty that I just told you about. And there are several other policies I enumerate in the book to explain the property tax foreclosure crisis. And when you use the language of racist policies, it forces the person making the claim to articulate the policies. And now that brings us to a place where we now can disassemble those policies.
Coming up, more with Plundered author Bernadette Atuahene. She'll share some thoughts on how the new presidential administration might handle housing and urban development. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with law professor Bernadette Atuahene about her new book, Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Home Ownership in America. In the book, Bernadette writes, quote, "American cities routinely replenish public accounts by bleeding Black and brown citizens, further widening the racial wealth gap," end quote. I asked Bernadette to give us an example of how that happens.
In my book, I develop a concept called predatory governance. And the definition of predatory governance is when public officials raise public dollars through racist policies. When they raise public dollars through policies, procedures, laws that cause racial inequity. So, we saw this in Ferguson, not only with our beloved brother Michael Brown, but there was an excellent DOJ report that shows that police in Ferguson were unconstitutionally policing Black people, targeting Black people, and subjecting them to fines and fees at excessive rates. And who benefited from that unconstitutional policing? It wasn't any corrupt police officer. It was the city of Ferguson itself. This is the same thing going on with this. Again, this is not a Detroit phenomenon. It's a national phenomenon of Black and brown homeowners being overtaxed. Who's benefiting from this overtaxing? It's not some corrupt government official. It's the cities themselves. The city of, it's the county of Wayne, the city of these are the entities benefiting. Currently, we don't have a conversation about public officials raising public dollars through these racist policies, but we see it all over. I can give you so many other examples nationally. When you look at the abuse of civil forfeiture in Washington, D.C. or Philly, that's another example. With civil forfeiture, the police are allowed to take property without putting it through trial. But in D.C., they would take the property and then force you to put up a bond of $1,500 or $2,000. And the point is, if you're too poor to put up that bond, that means you never get your day in court and they get your property. And they raise millions and millions of dollars based on this practice. Where did that money go? Not to any corrupt police officer, but it went into the police budget itself. And so this book, through this idea of predatory governance, is starting a conversation about the many, many instances that we have of, again, public officials raising public dollars through these racist policies. I even talk about an instance in New Orleans where basically, the courts, you're not supposed to jail people because they can't pay. You're supposed to do an ability to pay hearing. But the courts were systematically not doing those ability to pay hearings and jailing people for not paying the fines or threatening them with jail so they would pay the fines that they couldn't afford to pay. Who benefited? It was the court themselves. Those were the funds the courts were using to keep itself alive. So I can go on and on. The property tax foreclosure crisis is just one example, but there's lots of different examples of predatory governance. And the book really uses the property tax foreclosure crisis in Detroit to talk about this larger phenomenon that we see throughout America. And that's what the book really does. It's the racist policies that we've been talking about, redlining, urban renewal, blockbusting, predatory mortgage lending, all of these policies exist in most Black communities all throughout America. It's not just a Detroit story. This is a story about how Black communities in Detroit, how racist policies have undermined Black homeownership throughout our nation.
And thinking about the question of who benefits from this, particularly because in so many places, those property taxes are connected to the funding of educational systems or the provision of other resources that often have a disparate impact on Black communities. And in many ways, that seems so overwhelming to think about who benefits, to think about the ways that policies can be constructed to withstand legal scrutiny sometimes, but to have that long-term impact. And the concern then is that some people feel so overwhelmed that they withdraw. And they sort of give up to say, I can't fight this. Wayne County has more resources than I could ever have. Or, the District of Columbia has more resources. I give up. This is a book that not only points out the problems and the challenges, but also offers strategies. And it talks about an organization you started. I don't know how you do this. You write books. You're a law professor. You're becoming certified by the state. You're doing all the things. You created this organization, the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. Talk to us about the work of that coalition.
Yeah. So, before I went to law school, I was a community organizer in South Central LA. I'm from LA. And so when my findings showed that since 2009, 1 in 3 homes had been taken through property tax foreclosure, and that we hadn't seen this number of property tax foreclosures in American history since the Great Depression, that, most academics would then just publish their findings. I think academia is an extractive neocolonial enterprise, and I'm being very intentional about not partaking in those parts. So, what academics usually do is they come in when they do interviews of poor people, they give them a research incentive, some modest research incentive. They write the papers, and they often don't even come back to give the people they interviewed the papers, nevertheless trying to spread the knowledge within the communities. And why do they do that? Not because they're bad people, because the academy does not give any credit for that dissemination work. The work of dissemination is time consuming, and there's no credit given for it. So systematically, people aren't doing it because the academy is not set up to do it. It's set up to write the paper and then move on to the next paper. Again, I was a community organizer. So when I saw this injustice, we got to work. We started organizing. And, immediately my law students and I started something called the Property Tax Appeal Project, where we actually appeal the illegally inflated property taxes for Detroit homeowners. So far, we've been doing this since 2019, and we've helped over 1,000 homeowners appeal their illegally inflated property taxes. But the Coalition for Property Tax Justice is the group of about a dozen Detroit grassroots organizations that got together around 3 goals. Number 1 is to stop these illegally inflated property taxes, not only in Detroit, but throughout America. Number 2 is to stop the continued foreclosure of homes in Detroit until we can make certain that everyone that's being foreclosed upon is being foreclosed upon for taxes they actually owe and not illegally inflated property taxes. And our third goal is to provide compensation. And through the compensation goal, we've started a project called the Dignity Restoration Project. If anyone's interested in that, they can go to the dignityrestorationproject.org. And that project is specifically intended to raise $10 million to compensate what we call the hardest hit. And those are people who were subjected to illegally inflated property taxes, and unable to pay property taxes that they should not have owed in the first place because they qualified for the poverty tax exemption. But the city of Detroit made it so difficult for people to access that entitlement that people lost their homes for property tax, illegally inflated property taxes they were not supposed to be paying in the first place. So we're raising $10 million to compensate that group of people. So through the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, that's again, we got together, and it was the research that really ignited this movement. Again, and Detroit is ground zero for the problem because no one has had as many foreclosures as Detroit. Although this is a national problem, Detroit is ground zero for this national problem. But Detroit is also ground zero for the fight back. Detroit is also ground zero for the fight back. So through the Coalition for Property Tax Justice, not only are we trying to solve the problem in Detroit, where we have passed 2 pieces of legislation, a property tax reform ordinance that simplifies, that, gets to the core problems of why the overtaxation is happening in Detroit. But we also have solutions at the state of Michigan level. Michigan is the second most regressive country in our nation, in our union. Regressivity means that the lower valued homes are taxed at a higher rate than the higher valued homes. Michigan is second worst behind Alabama and ahead of Mississippi. I said, if you're behind Alabama and ahead of Mississippi on any issue, you are in trouble. Michigan is in trouble. So we have some solutions at the state level. And then we also have our representative, Rashida Tlaib, has allowed us to have 2 meetings with Marcia Fudge, because we also have some solutions at the federal level for how to deal with these illegally inflated property taxes nationally. So again, Detroit is ground zero for the problem, but it's also ground zero for the fight back. The solutions that we are creating in Detroit will be useful all over the nation. Because I always say the people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solutions. And that's why these solutions it's not by accident that the solutions are coming from Detroit.
You mentioned Marcia Fudge, who is the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The White House has named a new secretary, who is Scott Turner, former NFL player, former Texas state representative. The work that you are talking about is already difficult, right? It's inherently difficult. It is complex. It relies on trust and building coalitions and having partners at every level of that. Given the current administration, given some of the not just reversals, but intentional things that we are seeing coming from the current administration, we have not yet heard much out of the new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. How do you expect those changes at the federal level to have an impact on the work that you and others are doing to draw attention to this issue, but as you said, to really fight back and promote solution?
So I remain hopeful. I might be naive, but I remain hopeful, because this is actually an issue that's across the aisle. Because we're talking about government abuse. And usually cases of government abuse, the right has been the one leading the way. Although it's poor Black and brown people who are the victims of it, it's been the right that's leading the way. And so this is a space where we're talking about government abuse. And so people on the right don't like it because they don't like government. People on the left don't like it because the victims are Black and brown, vulnerable people. And so it's a space where I'm hopeful that we still, given the current political climate, may be able to move forward with some solutions. And just to give you an example, what do some of the solutions on the federal level look like? Well, it's a 2-step process. The first is the University of Chicago Center for Municipal Finance has created a database where anyone can go hover over where they live to see if property taxes are fair, calculated fairly in your area. So the first thing is awareness. And so what we wanted HUD to do is to take that database on, take it to the next level, add some racial elements into it, some race data, and make it available to all jurisdictions throughout America. That's step one, is for people to know if there's a problem in their jurisdiction. And step two is we were asking HUD to use, again, its powers through the Fair Housing Act to then to put the top 10% of worst offenders of regressivity, again, where the lower valued homes are taxed at a higher rate than the higher valued homes, top 10, and put them on a corrective action plan. And it's not meant to be punishment. It's because a lot of these localities want to get it right, but they're dealing with antiquated systems from the 80s, right? They're not doing simple regression analysis. And so it's to provide them with technical assistance to help them get up to speed. And so that's part two, is HUD putting them in a corrected, the worst offenders in a corrective action plan. That's the same model we have for the state of Michigan as well, is for them to use their audit process to provide local assessors with technical assistance to help them get it right. So these are the kinds of solutions that we're moving forward. And again, because it's about overtaxation, it's a cross the aisle issue. So I remain hopeful that we'll still be able to move forward despite the hectic political climate we find ourselves in.
I love the framing that if you are opposed to government overreach, government inefficiency, the intentional abuse of power that shows up here, this should be an issue where political party ideology does not matter, but being able to address that to go forward. I have all kinds of questions about when this book is becoming the documentary and all the new places that this can go. But my final question is a simple one. What does this work mean to you?
I mean, to me, it means so much. What gives me life and hope, all my work again, deals with land stolen from Black people. So it's pretty depressing. But what gives me hope is exactly the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. It's the fight back that gives me hope. So a lot of people ask me, oh, if it's illegal, why not take it to court? And so I do want to address that before we close up, which is to say we did take it to court. And we had the legal dream team. We had the ACLU of Michigan, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Covington Burling for Deep Pockets. Brought 2 cases. One case was against the Wayne County for under the Fair Housing Act for this racialized property tax administration I was describing earlier. And the second case was against the city of Detroit for obstructive administration of the poverty tax exemption. So the case against Wayne County, the Fair Housing Act case, you won't believe me when I tell you, but although we have all of this data that I just explained to you between 2009 and 2015, up to 85% of properties were being assessed in violation of the Michigan State Constitution. The city of Detroit agrees, they've admitted that that's, so no one is fighting the data. But this data has never been looked at by a court. Why is that? Because the case comes, we couldn't go to federal court because of something called the Tax Injunction Act, which disallows federal courts from looking to issues of state taxation. So we had to go to the state court in Michigan, and Judge Colombo had the case, and he said, you came to the wrong court. You shouldn't be here. You should be in the Michigan Tax Tribunal. We appeal. They agree with Judge Colombo, go to the Michigan Supreme Court. They don't grant cert, so the lower court decision stands. And that kills the case for 3 reasons. Number one, the Michigan Tax Tribunal is not a court. It's an administrative agency. And so because it's an administrative agency, it doesn't have injunctive power. And that's what we're asking the court to do, to tell Detroit to stop these illegal assessments. They don't have injunctive power. Also, because they're an administrative agency and not a court, they don't have a class action facility. And all the cases have to be brought one by one by one. There's no way to address systemic inequality, which is what we were trying to address. And third and final, in order to bring it before the Michigan Tax Tribunal, you had to bring it between January 1st and January 15th, whereas the Fair Housing Act gives you 2 years. So for those 3 reasons, this improper venue ruling kills the case. And so till this day, although no one is contesting the data, no court has looked at this data. And, I'm a law professor, and we teach our students, if something's illegal, you take it to court and you get a remedy. We don't teach them about the numerous instances like this one where some procedural barrier prevents you from getting substantive justice. So, but in general, it's the fight back. Not only, when we got stopped in the law, when the law couldn't give us a solution, we didn't just stop there. We then moved to this political organizing, and we formed the Coalition for Property Tax Justice. And since the legal remedy couldn't be found, we then moved towards political remedies. And like I said, we've already passed a property tax reform ordinance and done all of this other work through the political system. But it's all of this fight back, whether it be legal or organizing, that gives me life. So you said, what does this work mean to me? It's the fight back that just gives me joy, brings me light, keeps me alive, and keeps me motivated.
I hope that we can all find, embrace, and commit to the fight back.
Yes, indeed.
We will need that in these times. Bernadette Atuahene is professor of law at the University of Southern California's Gould School of Law. Her new book is Plundered: How Racist Policies Undermine Black Homeownership in America. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. This was such a special conversation. Thank you for having me.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. Our interns are Angelica Gajewski and Kathy Wang. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcast. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.